got the big boom outside that's got to come in, and I got to get the metal work started on that. Needs some support plates cut off of it. Needs the end of it plated and chucked up to accommodate the new gooseneck, which is this. So this thing has got to be put onto the mast itself. It has to be riveted in. So in order for the new setup to work, the boom has an eyelet that sticks out kind of like this, and then it fastened into a pair of plates on the mast itself. So we're basically reversing that. So I have to put gusset and pivot plates onto the end of the boom. I'll probably drag this boom in. It's going to be a pretty nasty process because we got paint to strip off of it. It has, you guys have heard me ramble on about that. Some creative welder, just slapped plates all over the side of this thing, and it looks like hell. And the whole thing needs to be disassembled anyway. The guts of it, the outhaul system, the reefing system, all that needs to be taken apart, repaired or upgraded, and then the thing needs to be put back together and welded up properly. I have to weld a couple of things on that are pretty critical, which is the end plates that you saw that we made for the new gooseneck. So I'm going to weld those on and then clean it up a little bit and see how they look, and I may end up welding a couple of support gussets on there just to be safe, but we'll see how it goes. All right, so a couple little tiny blemishes in there, but I don't care about those. The whole thing's getting primed and faired and all that, so there's little tiny blemishes I can worry about then. Still working on the boom. Been doing some welding, as we discussed before. What's been going on is, I got these welded in place. I welded in some stuff here yesterday, and you see all these little voids and all that, and I was kind of scratching my head because I'd cleaned it real well and had it prepped, and I did a little bit of digging around, and then this joint is a blade style joint. So if you think there's a socket like that and then there's a blade that slips into it. So basically what's happened is this thing has, you can see what the opening is here, but if we go down, you'll see it gets a little tighter, then it gets a little wider, and it's got some areas that are really wide. So what's happened is that joint has loosened up over the years. Originally, they would have put these half shells together either with epoxy or some kind of an adhesive, and then weld in these end plates. And on the other end, that end plate, because that's where the gooseneck connects, that end plate is a 1/2 inch thick, and then there's a doubler in here, another 1/2 inch, where the pintle used to go through and fasten. Otherwise, the rest of this seam really just relied on that sealant. So what has happened is this bottom section here is the receiver, so it's the groove like this. Top section obviously is the blade. So what's happened is, as this has opened up, and after 40 years of being at sea, this thing has gotten seawater in it, and that sealant has failed, and it has filled that groove at some point with water or mist or salt, and it's corroded. So as a result, every time I try to weld this, because I really just wanted to weld this seam closed, getting rid of the need to have all those nasty looking plates and the crummy looking welds that were on here, I was going to weld this closed, grind this flat, fair the whole thing out, get it primed and then painted, and get all the guts put back in and put it back on the boat. Well, of course, you know, that can't be that easy. So now what happens is, you know, this aluminum, I think this is probably Almag, probably like a 50-52 blend aluminum. I'm pretty sure that's probably what it is. It's pretty common aluminum for, you know, maritime use. So you can see the bottom of that receptacle, that socket, this bulge out right here is what creates that pocket for this blade. That groove is full of aluminum oxide. Well, aluminum oxide is like a crystalline structure, meaning that it is very heat resistant. So this 50-52, this stuff melts at like, I don't know, somewhere in the ballpark of 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, the aluminum oxide doesn't melt until it's like 36 or 3800 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can't burn through it, and as soon as it heats up to welding temperatures, it emits hydrogen gas, which blows out the weld. So that's why I ended up with all these pockets. And you know, I would clean this stuff out and I'd grind it back and I'd clean all the oxide out of there again, and then I'd hit it again and it would blow out right next to it because there was more oxide that was hidden in there. And apparently this is a somewhat common problem with spars, so booms and masts, where they use these half shell extrusions. What I have to do is I have to come along here and cut this tab off of the outside. So if you think about that groove like that, I need to cut the outside like this. So the blade will still be sticking in, you know, but the outside flap will be taken off. And then that will allow me to get in there and clean out that oxide, blow it out, get underneath of it, pry the joint open, you know, clean out all the crap, and then I can come back and weld the whole thing. So instead of having this, you know, relatively modest gap, I'm going to end up with a seam like that that's going to have to be welded. So that's all going to have to be built up. And it's pretty critical that I get this thing welded up because, again, over years it started to separate, and it separated pretty considerably. I would imagine that this gap probably constitutes half of the length of that blade, if not, you know, close to 3/4 of it. I can't push them together because there's too much crap in there, so I have to be able to bond these things more permanently. That's where I'm at. I have to do that. There's really no other options, not like it's something else where I could fill it in with thickened epoxy and then lay up glass over it and that's it, because that would end catastrophically. I had to cut the tab away, as you can see down here. Been cutting it in sections simply because, you know, I don't want to release the whole assembly at once, but that's the tab. So I have to cut along that line. That opens it up to the bottom of the groove. Then I have to pry this thing open and get in there with whatever the hell tool I can find to clean that mess out, because if I don't, what happens is, as the heat builds up in that weld, which takes seconds, the oxide is vaporing off hydrogen, and that old adhesive, whatever it is, it's probably methacrylate or something like that, it burns off and produces gas and bubbles up through the weld, and then it turns it into a popcorn mess. So then I have to go in, fill, grind, fill, grind, fill, grind, clean out the smut that comes with welding this kind of aluminum, and grind and grind and grind. So I ended up using probably twice as much, if not 3 times as much, welding wire as you would ordinarily use, because I'm having to go back and fill and grind, fill and grind, fill and grind, trying to burn through these impurities. And then I finally get them out, and then, you know, great, I can move on to the next thing. Trying to get rid of a problem that's been a problem since it was manufactured, and that is the fact that this seam is open to salt air So it allows salt air to get in there and crystallize and cause oxide. So it's basically rotting this thing from the inside out. Now, 40 years and the thing hasn't collapsed, it hasn't fallen apart, but it's been a problem because it's moved. These seams have opened up in places, not completely, because that tab is about a ½ inch long, but nevertheless, the seams have opened up in places. It's caused an issue, and there's a lot of stress on that. And then somebody did a cobbled up, half-assed mess of a patch job on it, which made it look like garbage. But for God's sakes, fix these things the right way and stop band-aiding everything. You put half as much money into it now, and it costs you 4 times as much later when you have to undo the damage that thing caused and all the grief that goes along with it. So just fix things the right way. Now that I got this opened up, you can see what it looks like when I first open it up. It goes from kind of that crap, which is all oxide. See the chunks of oxide down in there. This is why these areas that were gapped up like that, I wasn't able to compress this and pull it back into place because there's so much crap built up down in that groove that there was no place for it to go. Actually, as I was cutting this section, by the time I got to about here, the extrusion popped open. It just released. So it opened up this way, sprung open, so I was just playing around with that clamp to see if it would pull back, and it will. So I'll pull it back into place before I weld it. Probably run along and spot weld it in some places to get it in line, and then we'll weld through. But yeah, this is what we end up with after we clean it, and then this is what we start with. And all of that crap has to come out of there.
Alright, that's probably a good stopping point for today. This part 1 of getting Olivia's boom brought back to life. Most of what you saw today was the not so exciting part, opening everything up, cleaning things out, and making sure the weld repair can actually be done right. But that kind of prep work is what makes the difference between something lasting and something failing again later. In the next video, we'll start getting the boom ready for paint and begin putting all the new hardware back on it, which is always the part where things start feeling like progress. Thank you for hanging out with us and following along on this journey with Olivia. We sure do appreciate it. Alright, we'll see you in the next one. And that pretty much wrapped up the day. Sean set the microphone on fire, and the lizard I tried to save bit me. Just another day around here working on Olivia.